I never imagined my life would spin out of control like this, but here I am, sitting at my kitchen table with an aching heart and a mind swirling with memories. My name's Mike, and until recently, I thought I had it all: a stable job, a loving home, and a marriage I believed was built on trust and respect. Jennifer and I had been married for over 10 years, sharing countless memories, both joyful and challenging. We had built a life together in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and things were supposed to be simple. But looking back now, I see that simplicity was just a veil hiding a deeper, darker truth. It wasn't that I was always suspicious. We both had our quirks, and like any couple, we faced our fair share of misunderstandings. Life wasn't perfect, but there was a kind of comfort in the routine of our daily lives. I worked as a mechanic at a local garage, fixing cars and hearing customers' stories, while Jennifer managed a local boutique, a business she was proud of, even though she always seemed to have a flair for drama. I always admired her for her ambition, though I now realize that ambition sometimes came with a side of deceit. The cracks first started appearing on what I once thought was an unbreakable foundation. It wasn't an explosive revelation or an overt confrontation at our dinner table. Instead, it was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, a subtle change in the way she spoke, a slight detachment in her eyes when we talked about our future, and a series of little excuses about why she couldn't be home at certain times. At first, I chalked it up to a busy schedule or just the natural drift that sometimes happens between longtime partners. I tried not to let it bother me too much, convincing myself that every relationship goes through ups and downs. But then came the nights when Jennifer would be working late, and the occasional forgotten phone calls that seemed too conveniently timed. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I was merely being cautious, trying to account for the little things. Yet, deep down, a gnawing feeling started to build, a sense that maybe the story wasn't as straightforward as I'd believed. I began to notice inconsistencies, sudden changes in her routine, long, unexplained absences, and an unexplained flutter of anxiety in her posture whenever my eyes met hers. The signs were subtle, like whispers in the silence of our home, hinting at secrets too heavy to share. I remember one particular evening quite vividly. I came home a little earlier than usual from the garage, expecting nothing more than a quiet night with Jennifer over dinner. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel the tension in the air, an almost tangible heaviness that pressed against my chest. The living room was dimly lit, and there was an unusual air of secrecy that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I heard hushed voices coming from our bedroom and, without any real thought, I edged closer. That's when I saw it, a glimpse of the unmistakable silhouette of a man in our bed. In that split second, all the small, nagging doubts that had been festering in my mind screamed that my worst fears were coming true. Before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, I froze. My heart pounded in my chest like a runaway freight train, and every instinct in my body told me to run, to hide, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I remember the silence was deafening. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping me in a moment I couldn't escape. I stood there, a mere observer to my own crumbling life, as the realization hit me with a force I never knew possible. Jennifer, the woman I'd trusted implicitly, was living a double life. The man in our bed wasn't just any random stranger, there was something all too familiar about him. I later learned his name was Brad, a man with a reputation that made my blood run cold, and someone who'd somehow found a way into my life in the most painful manner imaginable. I had always prided myself on being a straightforward, honest guy, a blue-collar man who believed in hard work, loyalty, and facing life head-on. Yet, as I stood there, paralyzed by shock and betrayal, I felt an inner turmoil I couldn't ignore. How could I have been so blind to the signs? I couldn't believe that the person I had built my world around was capable of such betrayal. It wasn't just the physical act that stung, it was the web of lies and deceit that had taken root over time. Jennifer's behavior had shifted gradually, but I had been too wrapped up in my own routine, trusting implicitly that she would never hurt me in such a manner. Looking back now, I realized that the path leading up to that fateful moment was littered with red flags. There were the seemingly innocent texts on her phone, the mysterious phone calls during dinner, and that look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't paying attention, a look that spoke volumes about hidden secrets. I remember trying to dismiss these thoughts, telling myself that I was overreacting, that I was reading too much into nothing, because letting these doubts fester would only spoil what we had. I wanted to believe that love was enough to hold us together, even in the face of adversity. In those days, my mind was a tumult of conflicting emotions. Part of me was desperate to cling to the relationship, to believe that maybe I was mistaken, that maybe there was an explanation that didn't involve infidelity. I questioned every laugh we shared, every smile, every tender moment, wondering if any of it had been genuine. But as time wore on, the dissonance between what I wanted to believe and the stark reality became impossible to ignore. That night marked the beginning of a series of events that would unravel everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and the sanctity of marriage. And though the shock and the heartache were still fresh, I knew that I couldn't simply pretend everything was fine. I had to start making sense of the sudden shifts, the unspoken truths, and the hidden betrayals that had seeped into my life. What followed was a journey through pain, anger, grief, and ultimately, a quest for understanding, a quest for reclaiming who I was, even as everything around me fell apart. As I sit here now, writing down these thoughts and memories, the emotional impact is still raw. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever expected, and while I was overwhelmed by the chaos of my feelings, I also knew that I had a decision to make, a decision about who I wanted to be in the face of such overwhelming deceit. I started to wonder if love alone was enough to heal the wounds of betrayal, or if sometimes, the truth is just too painful to bear. This is where my story really begins, a story of broken trust, of secrets unveiled too late, and of the painful journey towards accepting a new reality. In the next parts, I'll delve deeper into how I discovered the full extent of Jennifer's deception, the confrontation that followed, and the myriad of emotions that swept over me like a tidal wave. I invite you to stick with me as I share the raw details of every moment, hoping that my experience might serve as a warning or even a guide for anyone out there dealing with similar heartache. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this painful chapter in my life, it's that sometimes, the truth, however painful, is the only way to begin healing. After that night, I can still see the scene in my mind like it was etched in stone. I felt as if my whole world had shifted on its axis. I left the house in a daze, my heart pounding erratically, and spent hours trying to come to grips with what I had seen. My mind replayed that moment over and over, the sight of Jennifer entwined with Brad in our bed, the sound of hushed voices behind closed doors, and the terrible silence that fell afterward. I couldn't tell myself it was a mistake or a misinterpretation. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just a fleeting moment of intimacy but a calculated betrayal that had been seeping into our lives for months. Over the next few days, I found myself spiraling into a state of constant alertness. I started to notice a pattern I hadn't before. Jennifer's alibis, which once sounded ordinary, now rang hollow and rehearsed. It wasn't just that she was working late or had meetings at odd hours, there were subtle inconsistencies that even a simple, hardworking guy like me couldn't ignore. I began quietly keeping track of her absences, the way she would quickly hide her phone whenever I entered the room, and the suspicious glances she exchanged with her friends when I was around. I felt like I was living in a nightmare where every little detail was screaming out the truth. I remember one particularly telling incident. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was fixing up the truck in our garage, a pastime that always helped clear my head. When I got a call from an old buddy, Tony, who works in the financial district. He casually mentioned that he'd seen Jennifer driving by the bank near downtown during lunch hours. He said it caught his attention because she'd never been interested in hanging around places like that before. At the time, I brushed off the comment, thinking maybe she was meeting someone for a business transaction or running an errand related to her boutique. But later, I started noticing more. I began finding small discrepancies on her calendar, some appointments with vague descriptions like client meeting that turned out to coincide exactly with the times I'd seen her driving by the bank. One afternoon, I took a risk. After a long day at work, I drove past the bank area out of curiosity. I parked a few blocks away and kept my eyes peeled. Sure enough, I spotted Jennifer's car, a dark blue sedan, rolling into the bank's parking lot. I watched silently as she got out, dressed in a business suit that she claimed was just for work at the boutique. From my vantage point, I saw her exchange a few words with a sharply dressed man whose presence exuded confidence and authority. It was Brad again, the man from that terrible night, and he now appeared in a completely different context. This wasn't the awkward, clandestine encounter I'd stumbled upon by accident, it was a deliberate rendezvous in broad daylight, right in front of a financial institution. I couldn't believe how brazen the situation was. The realization that my wife had been lying to me started to take an almost physical form. My mind began piecing together all the moments that, at the time, I'd dismissed as trivial. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way she'd suddenly become defensive when asked about her whereabouts, it all pointed to a truth I had been too afraid to fully accept. I started to hunt for more evidence. I recalled the texts on her phone that she had tried to hide from me. With a pounding heart and trembling hands, I sat down one evening when she was out with a friend, and scoured through her messages on my own phone, trying to piece together a timeline. Each message, each late-night conversation, only cemented the painful truth that there was a long-running affair unfolding right under my nose. But it wasn't just digital traces that confirmed my worst fears, it was also the behavioral changes in Jennifer. Over the following weeks, I noticed how she transformed when she thought I wasn't watching. In the mornings, her makeup was a bit too perfect, her hair styled in a way that screamed attention, and her posture exuded a kind of smug satisfaction that I'd never seen before. She became flirtatious not only in private but in public as well, laughing too loudly at the banker's jokes and touching his arm in a way that left no room for ambiguity. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was just being overly sensitive, that I was imagining these things because I already felt betrayed. But deep down, I knew that the evidence was undeniable. I spent sleepless nights grappling with a growing fury and helplessness. Part of me wanted to confront Jennifer immediately, to demand an explanation that I knew would be filled with lies and hollow reassurances. But another part of me was paralyzed by the thought of shattering our past life so abruptly. I went through every conversation we had ever shared, clinging to memories of when I believed in her loyalty, trying desperately to find any sign that she wasn't always the deceiver I was now coming to see her as. It was like watching the most painful movie of my own life in slow motion, each frame deepening my agony. In my quest for answers, I confronted mutual friends who might have seen something, or perhaps sensed something amiss. I even reached out to someone from the bank, though indirectly, hoping for some confirmation or an explanation that could somehow explain away what I was witnessing. Every lead only led to more questions. It wasn't long before I began to feel utterly isolated, trapped in a web of betrayal where every thread pointed back to Jennifer. She'd always been proud, even a bit arrogant, and now I saw that arrogance had evolved into a manipulative tool in her arsenal of lies. She crafted excuses with surgical precision, twisting truths and making me second-guess my instincts. I realized that the woman I'd once loved was now a stranger, someone who valued her own desires over our shared life. One particularly excruciating afternoon, I tried to confront the situation head-on by checking our home computer's browser history, hoping for some additional evidence that might lead to a clear-cut answer. What I found was a digital trail that was damning, hidden logins, secret messages, and even emails that referenced confidential meetings. Each piece of information was like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. I remember the moment I saw an email with the subject line, "Our next move," from Brad, my stomach twisted into knots. It described plans that seemed far more than a single, impulsive affair. It was a calculated strategy, hinting at an ongoing relationship with long-term objectives. The realization left me reeling. The betrayal wasn't an impulsive mistake but a carefully managed double life. At this point, I wasn't just dealing with infidelity, I was dealing with a complete overhaul of everything I thought I knew about trust and love. All the while, I battled a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, disappointment, and a growing sense of disbelief. Every time I replayed the evidence, it felt like a brutal reminder that my marriage was built on a lie. I found myself questioning every moment, every conversation I had with Jennifer, wondering where I had gone wrong. Was I too trusting? Too naive? I wanted answers, but each new discovery only deepened the mystery and the hurt. The more I uncovered, the more I saw that Jennifer was living a life separate from our shared promises. I began to understand that her involvement with Brad wasn't just about physical attraction, it was about a complete disregard for our vows, a disregard for me. Every secret rendezvous, every carefully hidden text or email, was a testament to her willingness to dismantle the very foundation of what we had built together. And as I pieced together these revelations, the man I once knew faded into a memory, replaced by someone who felt betrayed and utterly abandoned. That period of discovery was intensely isolating. I found myself avoiding familiar places where we once found comfort. The diner where we used to sit for coffee, our favorite park bench, and even the quiet corners of our home now evoked memories laced with deception. I became hyper-aware of everything, the tone in her voice when she answered my questions, the way her eyes would flicker with a glimmer of guilt before she masked it with a smirk, and the peculiar ways she would laugh off my concerns. It was as if she was living in a constant state of performance, an act meant to deflect my pain and mask her betrayal. Every piece of evidence, every stolen moment I witnessed, left me feeling more alienated from the life I once cherished. It wasn't just the act of betrayal that stung, it was the realization that someone I had trusted with every part of my heart had engineered this web of lies so meticulously. I had taken for granted the simplicity of our life, the unspoken bonds of loyalty and commitment that I believed were unbreakable. Now, confronting the reality of Jennifer's actions was like coming face to face with a monster born of deceit. I began to document everything, almost obsessively. Every call, every meeting, every suspicious absence was logged in a notebook, as if by writing them down, I could somehow regain control over the situation. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about clarity, about facing the truth head-on, no matter how painful it might be. I wrote down every memory, every detail that pointed to the fact that this was not a one-time lapse but a prolonged affair. I wanted to understand the extent of her deception, hoping that by laying out the facts, I might finally find some semblance of truth amidst the chaos. Looking back now, the discovery phase was the darkest part of this whole ordeal. It was a time filled with sleepless nights, painful reflections, and a gnawing sense of betrayal that never seemed to ease. Every new piece of evidence drove home the fact that the woman I had loved was capable of unimaginable deceit. And yet, in the midst of that darkness, I also realized something crucial: knowing the truth, however devastating, was the first step towards reclaiming my own life. I couldn't live in a state of perpetual doubt and uncertainty, questioning every word and gesture. I had to muster the courage to face the man in the mirror, a man who, despite all the pain, still held a spark of hope for a future built on honesty. So, as I pieced together the puzzle of Jennifer's double life, I was forced to confront not only the betrayal itself but the reality that our relationship had been compromised long before that fateful night. I learned that small signs, ignored over time, can culminate in a betrayal that shakes your very core. My world had been irrevocably altered, and there was no going back to the way things were. The discovery process had left scars that might never fully heal, but it also lit a fire inside me, a determination to understand, to rebuild, and maybe, eventually, to forgive, if not for her sake then for mine. This phase of revelation pushed me into a territory of emotional and mental exhaustion, but I refused to let it break me completely. I clung to the fragments of who I was before all this began, the hardworking, honest guy who believed in truth and integrity. And even as I acknowledged the painful evidence of Jennifer's betrayal, I recognized that I had a choice to either let this define me or to rise above it. The journey ahead would be long and winding, filled with more heartbreak and unexpected twists, but I knew that I owed it to myself to seek the truth, no matter how hard it might be to accept. Overwhelmed by the mounting evidence of betrayal, I finally decided to confront Jennifer. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I said firmly, "Jennifer, we need to talk." Her attempts to justify her actions and downplay my suspicions only deepened my pain and anger. I accused her that her constant, late meetings with Brad were nothing less than betrayal. Despite her tentative apologies and claims of feeling lonely, it quickly became clear that trust was irreparably broken. In that moment, amid a storm of raw emotions, I realized that any further effort to salvage our relationship was futile, and with a heavy heart, I left the house. After the confrontation, I was engulfed by a profound emptiness. Every evening became an endless battle between anger and deep sorrow. I spent sleepless nights trying to make sense of what had happened, while the days passed in a fog of desolation. Even when I sought distraction in the garage, every task reminded me of the betrayal. I dusted off an old journal to pour out my pain, yet words alone couldn't capture the loss of trust or the shattering of my hopes. Even memories of our happier times turned bitter under the weight of lies. As the days turned into weeks, I realized that, although the wound still stung, I had to learn to move on and reclaim who I once was. I soon faced a painful choice: try to save the relationship or let it end for good. All the evidence had shown that our life had been destroyed by lies. Accepting that trust was beyond repair, I realized I deserved a future built on honesty and sincerity. One restless morning in the garage, I made up my mind to end the painful illusion. I told her that love and trust cannot survive in an atmosphere of constant deception and that it was time to go separate ways. Although this decision brought a fresh wave of pain, it also opened the door to rebuilding my life. I reached out to friends, sought therapy, and began working on myself, gradually regaining my confidence and self-worth. Looking back, it's hard to believe that a life I once deemed unshakable could fall apart because of deceit and betrayal. Ending the relationship was a painful but necessary step that allowed me to re-examine my values and learn to love myself. The suffering I endured eventually transformed into valuable lessons. True trust and self-respect are essential for any real connection. Morning drives, honest conversations with friends, and the support of my therapist taught me that even after deep pain, there's a possibility for new beginnings. Every small victory, whether returning to my old hobbies or enjoying a quiet evening alone, reminded me that I am defined not by betrayal, but by my resilience. I now understand that while the past can never be erased, it can serve as the foundation for a future built on honesty, self-worth, and hope.